About 10 years ago, my sister and I picked up a new game. We didn't play many multiplayer games, but we were really big Final Fantasy fans. And we discovered Final Fantasy XIV. You know, Final Fantasy XIV.
Don't forget, you'll soon be able to play the critically acclaimed MMORPG Final Fantasy XIV online with an expanded free trial, which you can play through the entirety of A Realm Reborn, Heavensward, and the Stormblood expansions up to level 70 for free, with no restrictions on playtime.
Yeah, that one. While the game has since found its stride and solidified itself as one of the biggest MMOs of all time, standing shoulder to shoulder with games like WoW, back then, the game still had a bit of a stigma attached to it for having one of the most disastrous launches of a major MMO in, well, ever. After the game's original leadership was taken to the chopping block, this weird guy, Naoki Yoshida, aka Yoshi P, was sent in to fix it by Square Enix. He did what he could, but in the end the only option was to blow up the game, both figuratively and literally. So Square Enix shut down the servers for a year while Yoshi P and his team reworked the game before bringing it back online as Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn. Though not without its faults, Realm Reborn was a drastic improvement over 1.0, and utilizing that momentum, Yoshi P and his team managed to build Final Fantasy XIV into the MMO that it is today. Say what you will about the game, but its success has been undeniable, and by the looks of it, it's not going anywhere anytime soon. So imagine the surprise of the Final Fantasy XIV community when Square Enix gave this guy the keys to making a mainline single-player Final Fantasy game. Then imagine their surprise when they found out it has motherfucking kaiju fights in it! Then imagine my surprise when I found out that it was going to be a timed PS5 exclusive and I was just a broke boy with a PS4. But hey, it was gonna be worth it! It's Yoshi P, the guy who saved Final Fantasy XIV. And it's being written by the guy who wrote Heavensward. You know, the award-winning expansion critically acclaimed Heavensward? This'll be awesome! And when it came out, it was... well... it was reviewed well by critics. Look, there's no two ways about it. Final Fantasy XVI was a success. It reviewed well, it sold well, and the general consensus for the game has been overall positive. But it wasn't without a lot of discourse among die-hard fans. Discourse isn't uncommon in Final Fantasy games these days. I'd honestly be more surprised if there wasn't any discourse around Final Fantasy XVI. However, there is a notable difference with Final Fantasy XVI compared to other games that have come out around the time, like the Final Fantasy VII Remake games and Final Fantasy XV back in the 2010s. Final Fantasy VII Remake is always going to be living in the shadow of the original, and Final Fantasy XV went through one of the most horrendous development cycles in gaming history. Final Fantasy XVI, on the other hand, didn't really face any of those issues. It was released a little bit after it was intended to because of COVID delays, but the product that launched was a complete and entirely original game that could be fairly judged solely on its own merits. And on its release, Final Fantasy XVI proved to be a very subdued take on the franchise. In spite of the flashy kaiju fights, cinematic trailers, and admittedly really cool opening hours of gameplay, it became very apparent to players that 16 made a conscious effort to divorce itself from many of the tropes of previous Final Fantasy games, both narratively and stylistically. To start, Final Fantasy XVI is a very serious game for very serious people, and it takes itself very seriously. While other Final Fantasy games aren't afraid to dive into dark subject matter, they do take time to allow for lighthearted moments to help ease the tension. 16, on the other hand, feels almost allergic to levity. There are no silly hijinks, there are no absurd side quests. The only laughter in this game is the maniacal kind. Even the famously fun and whimsical Chocobo theme is relegated to a brief fanfare that feels more like it was done out of obligation rather than an actual desire to include it. It's crazy to say it, but Berserk, one of the most notoriously grim mangas ever written, and a series that Yoshi P has cited as one of his influences, has more comedic moments than this game does. Outside of a very select few characters in a very select few scenes, the game spends its entire 40-hour playtime filled with nothing but deadpan stares, stoic brooding, and an occasional wry comment from Clive. Some people might like this, but I personally feel that it detracts from the game. Clive's story is an epic tale that spans over the course of 18 years. It's a tale of adventure, and love, and revenge, and hope, and all the things you'd expect to see in a Final Fantasy game. He starts out at his lowest of lows, alone and without anything to fight for except a desire for revenge. Then, by the end of the game, he's a hopeful idealist that has created his own found family and wants to see the world prosper so that way his found family can live a better life in it. On its face, it's a good arc, and one that we've seen done well in previous Final Fantasy games. But because the game insists on never allowing the story to just stop and take a breath and let characters smile for a bit, it robs the story of opportunities to humanize Clive. Yes, there are humanizing moments for him throughout the game, but they're almost always interwoven with tragedy. You could say it's because he's a gruff guy that never lets his guard down, but so's Geralt of Rivia, and some of the best moments in the Witcher series are the parts where he's just bullshitting with his buddies. Beyond its serious and somber tone, the game also has an art direction that's very bland. At least bland compared to previous Final Fantasy games. It's got good designs in it, and there are moments where the Final Fantasy style really shines through, but those moments are stretched far and few between an endless series of greystone castles and desaturated grassy fields and forests. Most of the character designs are pretty good among the main cast, but the majority of NPCs are otherwise unremarkable. And the enemies are even worse. Most of what you'll be fighting throughout the game are just generic soldiers. I honestly could not recall what most of them looked like until rewatching the footage. The lack of any real enemy variety doesn't help either. Just a quick glance through the bestiary will show you that this game is in very short supply when it comes to enemy types, with more of the iconic Final Fantasy enemies typically being relegated to boss fights. This is made all the worse by the fact that most of the enemies in this game are just really, really boring to fight. Outside of bosses, you can expect combat to play out in one of two ways. Either you fight a horde of trash mobs that got lost on their way to a Dynasty Warrior audition, or you fight a horde of weak trash mobs and a single big enemy with 3 very identifiable attack patterns. Sometimes, if the game is feeling real spicy, it'll throw in 2 big enemies at you. As the game progresses, they decide to up the difficulty by just pumping them up with more and more HP. This creates almost comedic situations where you'll find yourself bullying these mobs into submission because they're too weak to fight you, but too stubborn to die. Throughout my 40-hour playthrough, I died only 3 times. The first was due to my own carelessness by not realizing I was standing in the get fucked zone. The second time because I forgot to restock on potions before fighting a gauntlet of enemies. And the third time was against a very late game boss that actually did catch me off guard. So, credit where credit is due, I guess. There is a hard mode that you can unlock after beating the game, but with how easy the game is on normal mode, I'd rather they have just included that as an option from the start. The game also massively cuts down on the RPG elements you'd expect from the series, in an effort to, I guess, lean more towards its Devil May Cry style of combat. And I'm not exactly a fan of this either. Don't get me wrong, I'm not the sort of guy who still lives in 2001 demanding that the series return to being a turn-based combat game, but even 15 and the remake games at least tried to integrate the more classic aspects of Final Fantasy games into their designs. 16, on the other hand, just wipes them out almost entirely. The biggest example of this is the party system, or I guess I should say its lack of one. Clive's party members come and go based on what's happening in the story. You can't control them or change their equipment, they just sorta operate on their own initiative, which is admittedly not the worst thing in the world. They do seem to be capable of taking care of themselves for the most part, but I can't tell if this is because their AI is competent, or because the enemy AI is so incompetent that they look better by comparison. The one exception is Clive's dog, Torgal, who you actually can control to some extent by issuing commands to them, but their impact is so marginal that I wouldn't fault you for forgetting those commands even exist. I know I sure fucking did. There is a leveling system, but it just gives you flat stat increases. These stats can also be increased through your gear and weapons, like in previous Final Fantasy games. Abilities, however, come in the form of various iconic stances, and are only achieved through story events, so you're not going to get those by leveling up. There are also some of the classic spells from the games, like Fire, Ice, Arrow, and Lightning, with each being associated with the different iconic aspects. But the spells are purely cosmetic. Elemental weaknesses and resistances don't exist in this game, so you can just use whatever spell or ability you want on whoever you want without consequences. One could argue that this is in an effort to make the game less complicated and better appeal to its combat system, which is a perspective that I would like to agree with if it wasn't so absolutely brain-dead 90% of the time. Before I start sounding too overtly negative, I think 16's combat system itself isn't bad. It's responsive, the dodging is quick and fluid, you can reliably cancel out of animations if you have to, and at no point in time did I feel like the controls were actively working against me. There were even a handful of fights that I really enjoyed, but none of them even came close to the enjoyment I got out of the Icon Kaiju fights. The Icon battles are able to circumvent any issues you might have with the combat system by just cranking the spectacle up to 11. These are the moments that the game really shines, and boy does it shine bright. I don't know if the Icon fights are so memorable because they're legitimately great moments, or if it's because they look better by comparison since they're often bookended by otherwise forgettable segments. But to me, they were fun all the same. The Ifrit and Garuda fight particularly reminded me a lot of the Metal Gear Rex vs. Ray fight from Metal Gear Solid 4. It's slow and clunky, but it kind of works by making you feel like you're a big, lumbering monster that can throw fucking fireballs. Then, the latter Icon fights offer a much smoother experience as Clive comes to understand his abilities, upping the speed and the scale to better match the epic proportions the fights are going for. These segments are awesome! I loved playing them, and I wish it had more of them. With that said, even I have to admit that once you start to see through all the flashy particle effects and cinematic camera angles, you'll begin noticing the combat is not that deep. Sometimes it's even a little archaic. Wait a minute. This looks familiar. Is it? Oh, fuck me. Really?
Enough, Sly Cooper.
But Final Fantasy isn't a series that's built solely on its gameplay elements. What matters is the context that underlies it. You don't have to have stellar gameplay to make a memorable boss fight. The Icon fights are incredibly impactful, not just because of their gameplay, but because of the context surrounding them. They're fun, they're cathartic, and I really liked them. However, the Icon fights only make up about 4 hours out of a 40-hour game. So, what about the other 36 hours? Well, in that regard, Final Fantasy XVI hits as much as it misses. And when that game is 40 hours long, that's about 20 hours worth of misses. In spite of my complaints about the game taking itself too seriously, XVI has a great story, with great characters, brought to life through absolutely stellar performances from the voice cast.
"13 years of killing. 13 years without the faintest glimmer of hope. It was only Joshua that kept me going. I swore that I would avenge his death. That I would kill his killer. That was the only thing that gave my life any meaning. But if it was me who killed Joshua and Murdoch and all the others, then why the hell am I still breathing?
I ask myself the same.
All the characters, even the minor ones, feel like living, breathing people with their own passions, their own motivations, and their own hopes and dreams. Which is why I find it endlessly frustrating that the game squanders so much of its narrative potential in favor of wasting the player's time. You know, that level. You know, the one slow, uninteresting level in an otherwise great game that goes on for way too long. But you spend the whole time saying to yourself, it's okay! Once we get past this part, everything is gonna get better. It's all hype from here. That is half of the quests in Final Fantasy XVI. So many times throughout the game, I found myself thinking, this is it! This is where the game is really going to pick up. Only to have the story held hostage by a series of uninteresting fetch quests like some sort of dopamine gatekeeper. If you've played Final Fantasy XIV before, then you know exactly what these quests are. You run around town, talk to 2 or 3 people who don't know anything useful, then you go talk to another guy you've never met before, who leads you to a place where you fight something, then you have a little debrief about the thing you did, and then you go and move on to the next quest, never hearing or speaking to any of these characters ever again. This isn't to say that slowing down to allow the narrative to breathe is a bad thing by any means. Sometimes the story needs to take a minute to let the player, just absorb their surroundings and decompress after major events. These could have been great opportunities for fun character building moments to act as a palate cleanser from all the doom and gloom surrounding them. But instead, they chose to make these quests so boring, in such an absolutely brazen way, that it feels disrespectful of the player's time. There are good ways to do these sorts of fetch quests, and not only have other games done them better before, another game from this same franchise did it better almost 30 years ago. The quest to sneak into Don Cornelio's mansion in Final Fantasy VII by disguising Cloud as a woman is, at its core, a fetch quest. You have 3 different items from across town that you have to bring to this one guy, who will then take those items and make it into another item that they give to you for you to be able to go into the next part of the game. But its execution is well thought out. It's silly, it's memorable, and most of all, it's fun. At no point during the quest did I ever feel like it was a narrative afterthought. It felt like just as much effort and investment went into writing that quest as all the other quests in the game. The same can't be said for 16's fetch quests. I'm not saying they needed to be filled with slapstick comedy or anything, but they needed to at least have some level of effort put into their writing, and that effort is just not there. All these pointless and trivial segments take up precious time throughout the main story in lieu of fostering meaningful character moments. And I feel like one of the biggest victims who suffers from this is Jill. Alright, so I'm about to go into some spoiler territory here about Jill's arc in Act 2, so consider yourself warned. Jill is a great character, and her relationship with Clive is one of the most mature takes on romance I've seen in a Final Fantasy game. While it might not have been theatric and grandiose in the same way of previous Final Fantasy games, it still felt real. She has a lot of depth as an individual. She grows up as a close friend to Clive and his brother Joshua, but realizes that her presence within the Rosefield family is that of a political prisoner. Then she's uprooted from that and taken as a prisoner to a different kingdom, where she endures over a decade of abuse and cruelty at the hands of Right, that guy. This guy who we never learn about until just before we meet him for the first time. Which is also, incidentally, the last time we meet him. This is clearly a major character moment for Jill's personal arc. So why is it that this is the first time we're meeting this dude? Like, are you really telling me that it was more important to have over a dozen brain-numbing quests about picking up ingredients and delivering letters instead of giving us just a single quest where we could come face-to-face with this integral character to Jill's storyline before we set out to kill him? Jill's confrontation with Imran is a good scene in spite of its incredibly brief setup, but it could have been something truly fantastic and memorable if they actually gave it a proper build-up. But no, we need to make sure that the player knows that they have to finish their fetch quest quota before proceeding to good content. Ironically, many of the optional side quests do have good writing in them that gives the player insight on Clive's friends, and also the world around him. So good, in fact, that if you were to put them into the main story instead, the game would come out much better for it. Yet many of these legitimately interesting quests are locked behind chains of other much more boring side quests that add nothing to the story. It's kinda baffling, really. It's like, it's clear that a lot of thought and love and effort went into the writing of this game's story, but they chose to deliver it in the worst way possible. I'm not against locking content behind side quests or anything. Many other Final Fantasy games have done exactly that, and it's been fine. But when your main quest is so padded, with nothing but fluff, maybe you should reconsider what content is most important to convey to the player. Fortunately, as you approach the last third of the game, the story finally hits a more consistent stride. But that is a very shallow consolation for the 25 or so hours that came before. Overall, by the end of my playthrough, I was left feeling very conflicted. The characters are fantastic, many of the boss fights are a lot of fun, and there were several moments where the story really hit me. When it's great, it's great. But when it's not great, well, it's really, really mediocre. If this game were cut down to 20 hours, I'd probably have walked away feeling like this was a great, albeit somewhat flawed addition to the series. But at 40 hours, Final Fantasy XVI manages to accomplish the rare feat of feeling both bloated and anemic. The genuinely great moments in the game are spread so far and thin between myriads of junk quests that ruin the story's pacing. All of this might have been somewhat mitigated if the typical combat encounters were actually engaging, but with it failing to deliver on that front as well, there's not really much you can do except turn your brain off and suffer through it until the story picks up steam again. But through all the peaks and valleys this game has, those peaks are some really high peaks. So high, in fact, that the only thing you can see are the other peaks that await you. In those moments, you don't think about all the arduous work it took to get there in the first place, and upon hitting the final hours of the game, I'd mostly forgotten about my earlier frustrations. Final Fantasy XVI is a game that finds a way to succeed in spite of trying to sabotage itself every step of the way. I find myself having difficulty recommending it because while those peaks were high enough for me to, even if for a moment, look past the frustrating tedium I had to suffer through to get there, I can't say for certain if others would feel the same way, especially for a game that takes an entire work week of playtime to beat. With how much 16 separates itself from many of the tropes of the past in favor of hearkening to the more Western fantasy influences of earlier Final Fantasy games, I feel like this game, oddly enough, would appeal more to people who aren't Final Fantasy fans. If you're the sort of person who likes the good old sword and board dark fantasy settings, then I think you might find something to enjoy here. The setting and dialogue is heavily rooted in classic medieval fantasy, but its strategic and conservative use of the Final Fantasy tropes and aesthetics creates a unique flair that distinguishes itself from similar Western fantasy games without overstaying its welcome to the point that it becomes too much for people who would otherwise be turned off by them. However, if you're a Final Fantasy fan who relishes in gunblades and belts galore, then while I do think this game does have a lot to offer you, it might also leave you wanting for something different, something more, perhaps. Something with more of a road trip feel, where the real focus is on the characters and their journey itself rather than the destination. A game that can be serious when it needs to, but isn't afraid to poke fun at itself. Final Fantasy XVI sought to separate itself from its predecessors, and for better or worse, it succeeded. While I won't be placing Final Fantasy XVI among my all-time favorites, I do think it is a commendable piece of work, and I think there are a lot of positive lessons that future Final Fantasy games could take away from it. Perhaps the next installment in the series will be able to find a happy middle ground for the franchise. Somewhere more grounded than the eccentricity of the Fabula Nova Crystallis games, but more fantastical than 16's stubborn rejection of all the tropes and tendencies that came before. Only time will tell what lies ahead for the future of the series. The only thing that's for certain is that there will always be another Final Fantasy game. And when it comes out, I'll probably be there to play that one too.